Have you ever wondered why soccer has never been very popular in the United States? Sure, there have been some legendary moments, and the United States has had its share of well-known legendary players. But the truth is that soccer in the United States has always been a secondary sport, even when it was at its height. So have you ever wondered why the United States is different? Now, for the sake of clarity in this video, I'm going to call association football soccer. If you don't like that, my apologies. I don't usually do that on this channel. But here, we're going to talk about football and soccer a lot. So when I'm talking about football, this is the United States variant, not like the Canadian or Australian game. And this is really an important distinction to make, right? In fact, one of the things you probably don't know is that soccer came to the United States before football was born. The Oneida Football Club was the first football club in the United States. So this club was formed in 1862 and played what they called the Boston game back then, which was kind of a hybrid of association football and rugby rules. But what historians and commentators tend to forget is that the rules of soccer were not all that well formulated in the 1860s, not even in England. For example, the 1863 Football Association rules from England still allowed for fair catches with the hands. This is a rule that lives on in American football as well as in Australian rules football. There was also a rule in those days that allowed for a touchdown and a try that reads almost like it came straight from an old rugby rule book. And in those days, scoring a goal meant kicking the ball above the crossbar, not below it. So when we're talking about the Oneida Football Club using odd rules, it wasn't just them. Everybody played the game with an odd set of rules back in those days. The problem is that we tend to look back at history in the light of our modern definitions and our modern controversies, modern problems, and so on. We tend to be really bad at looking at history for what it really is. So for example, we will expect to see sports that we recognize today. But the truth is that soccer and rugby both originated in the exact same schoolyard games. In fact, we should expect there to be a lot of this crossover. And it's a little bit off the subject, but there was actually a lot of controversy in soccer when they did away with that fair catch rule. You see, there were players in soccer, association football, who were fair catch specialists back in the 1860s. Now, in the old days, what eventually became American football was rugby, pure and simple. In fact, the famous first college football game in the United States was a rugby game played under the old rugby rules. In the 1870s, Walter Camp started playing around with the rules of rugby, hoping to make the game seem a little bit more orderly and civilized. And so the famous 1874 Harvard versus McGill game featured the old-fashioned kind of scrum where the ball was placed between two teams when it was dead. It was not until 1880 that so-called scrummage turned into scrimmage, and one team had possession of the ball instead of the all-out battle between both teams. And it wasn't until later in that decade that other adjustments were made, such as the down system, allowing players to block each other, and so on. Now, I bring all of this up because there's this idea that soccer didn't develop in the United States because football was already so popular. That is simply not true, and you should be really frustrated and angry with any historian who makes that claim. Football was not extraordinarily popular in the United States in the 1880s. It was not really until the 1890s that the sport started to spread, by which time soccer already had a foothold in the country, including a professional league. And of course, as I mentioned, soccer was in the United States first. For example, the American Football Association was formed in 1884, which makes it one of the oldest sporting leagues in the United States and among the oldest soccer organizations in the world. If you read articles about football in United States newspapers from 1884 and 1885, chances are that you're actually reading about soccer. Back in those days, only a few Eastern schools played American football, and the rules were still very much in flux. But college football had something that soccer didn't have. It had the spectacle, and for one reason or another, it was able to get a lot more attention from the influential newspapers in New York and in Massachusetts. So for example, the Princeton-Yale football game on Thanksgiving in 1884 received a front-page report in the New York Times. The crowd at the Polo Grounds was only a little bit over 10,000, so it was likely not a sellout. While the same New York Times did have reports of soccer games, these were extremely brief and were far from the front page. Football was fiercer, more violent, more militant, and simply more attractive to the United States press back in those days. The irony is that soccer was already doing better in terms of being a professional sport. In fact, the first professional soccer league in the United States predated the formation of the National Football League by about 30 years. That would be the American League of Professional Football. This was a league formed in October 1894 that existed for a very short period of time. The league was formed by the owners of teams in baseball's National League who wanted to earn some extra money during the off-season. Now, this league did receive some newspaper attention. However, the sport was treated as a foreign sport, and newspaper coverage made it clear that most fans and players were immigrants. In the end, the professional league didn't even last a full month. It was a failure, though at least it was not a particularly public failure because most people didn't know that the league existed. But the irony is that the version of football played in the United States colleges was becoming absolutely notorious and very well known at the exact same time. The 1894 Yale Bulldogs football team set a record by winning 16 games without losing, a record that was only matched by Indiana University in 2025. Now, what ESPN will not tell you about Yale is that its biggest game that season was one of the most violent football games in the history of the sport. You see, football in 1894 was huge news, and the reporting played up the game as some sort of mystical story of conquest and valor. The influential Boston Globe devoted almost its entire November 24, 1894 paper to the upcoming Harvard-Yale game. Known as the Hampton Park Bloodbath, that game was one of the most violent in history and made the sport absolutely notorious. Numerous players on both sides were seriously injured, and the blame was placed on football's emphasis on mass plays and the uncompromising military tactics. The massacre was so infamous that Harvard and Yale refused to play against each other for 2 more years. Now, the thing you have to understand is that violence and brutality and mayhem makes for great newspaper stories. And so the legacy of football grew kind of on the back of yellow journalism, while soccer gradually disappeared from the newspapers. And this only got worse as the years went on. The violence in football was so extreme that U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt openly called for reform in 1905 in the name of player safety. And we're not just talking about injuries, we're talking player deaths. On-field fatalities were on the rise, and you need to remember that these were college students. These were not fully grown professionals. Actually, 1909 wound up being the worst year on record. This was after Teddy Roosevelt's reforms came about. And people tend to overlook all the gruesome and horrific non-fatal injuries that were associated with the sport back in those days. You could absolutely make the argument that American society is brutal and violent by nature as reflected in its fascination with American football. Soccer was still being played in the United States at this time, but it was nowhere near as notorious as football. And so football got all the press, it got mentions in the movies later on, and all the attention, and soccer just sort of limped along. Now, the first serious and meaningful attempt at a professional soccer league was the American Soccer League, which was formed back in May 1921. But before you get too excited about the infamous ASL, you have to understand that at least half of its 8 teams in the beginning were based in small cities. For example, Harrison Soccer Club was based in Kearney, New Jersey, which had a population of maybe 30,000 people at the time. J&P Coates was a Scottish thread-making company, and its team in the ASL was based out of its factory in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. The Falco Athletic Club was based in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is a town with a population of about 60,000 or so. Meanwhile, the biggest and most popular team was in Fall River, Massachusetts, one of the few cities in the league that actually offered press coverage of the sport. This is why I always have to scratch my head when I hear soccer historians claim that soccer was the second most popular sport in the United States in the 1920s. It was not. It simply was not. This is an insane thing to say. The American Soccer League might have had teams in Philadelphia, New York City, and Brooklyn, and Jersey City, but very few people in any of those cities cared or paid any attention. In fact, the Jersey City Celtic team folded after only 5 games in 1921. Newspaper coverage of the sport was extremely limited, even in the heyday of the league. So, for example, in 1927, you'll find tons of articles about the league from places like New Bedford, Massachusetts. Now, if you focus your research only on these newspapers, you will start believing that the ASL really was a big deal. But even in New Bedford, the sport would generally take a back seat if it competed with college football or baseball. American soccer never had anything even remotely close to the fabled Four Horsemen of Notre Dame, for example. Syndicated national columnists like Grantland Rice loved the sport of football, the American sport, and paid absolutely no attention at all to the fledgling professional American Soccer League. In fact, the unassailable position American-style football has in American culture really owes a lot to this first paragraph, which describes the infamous feats of Struldreher, Miller, Crowley, and Layden. You see, the trick to getting people to care about your sport or your YouTube channel or like your blog or whatever is to give them a reason to care. People need some reason to identify with something that you're doing. If you're making a sports league, you need to give people a reason to identify with one of your teams or with the other team or something like this. Now, playing the sport, first of all, having teams is a pretty good start, sure, but you really need drama and you need a real storyline to get people interested. This is why people continue to watch professional wrestling, right? Soccer has never had anything quite like that description of a cyclone that can't be snared that Grantland Rice wrote about the Four Horsemen. Anyway, the American Soccer League constantly butted heads with the United States Football Association and its nationwide Challenge Cup. That controversy exploded into a full-out soccer war by the late 1920s, one that really damaged what little interest the sport had created by that time. Charles Stoneham, who owned the baseball New York Giants and was a notorious gambler, purchased one of the ASL teams before the early 1930s and tried to force the league out of the cup. Stoneham was also frustrated by the lack of profit and threatened multiple times to simply withdraw his team from the sport altogether. And that led to the dissolution of the ASL in the early 1930s. This is long before it could have become anything remotely big. And it wasn't really until the NASL started to grow in the 1970s that the United States had anything even approaching a large and popular professional soccer league again. Now, the thing I've got to point out, as painful as this is to hear, is that college football had none of this sort of ugly controversy in the 1920s. Sure, you had multiple undefeated college football teams every year. Dartmouth won all 8 of its games in 1925, for example. So did Michigan, as well as 3 other major schools. But the fact that a team like Hawaii had as much of a claim to the title as any other football team didn't really harm the sport. Actually, the lack of a playoff and the loose structure was a big part of the appeal of college football back in those days. And of course, college football got much bigger and much more positive headlines than soccer could ever dream of. Anyway, by the time the 1970s rolled around, soccer was basically playing catch-up. In fact, the whole reason why the New York Cosmos signed Pelé and started signing other major players was to try to stir up at least some interest in soccer in the United States. The 1966 World Cup renewed interest in soccer in the United States. Alternatively, you could also think of the event as demonstrating that there was a lot more interest in the sport than most people realized. The NASL was formed and promoted by people who were trying to capture this interest. Part of the NASL's problem, though, is that the television announcers kept trying to explain the sport as if the audience were a bunch of idiots. And poor officiating and constant arguing really damaged the league's image. And so when the league disappeared, most people in the United States sporting public didn't really notice or care. Now, things have changed in our day, right? It's a lot more popular, this sport, in the United States than it was. However, I honestly think that this has a lot more to do with expanded television options than anything to do with like how well or how poorly Major League Soccer has done. In fact, if you really compare it, you will see that Major League Soccer gets less coverage in today's American sporting press and on television than the NASL did in the late 1970s. And the hype surrounding the sport in general in the United States has largely disappeared. You don't see articles these days about soccer being the fastest growing sport in the United States, though they were common back in 1978. Of course, the promise of future growth wound up being short-lived. And so, when the United States famously beat England in the summer 1993 friendly, most fans in the United States were not actually watching. You would think that this dramatic match would have been a huge hit, but the truth is that most people paid no attention at all. And it's kind of a shame since we might not ever see anything quite like this ever again. Now, I guess that this all depends on what this year's World Cup is going to bring. Look, the thing is that even if the United States somehow, through some miracle, manages to win a World Cup, it's going to take a lot more than a World Cup victory to turn soccer into more than a niche sport in the United States. Soccer still lacks the pageantry, it lacks the tradition, it even lacks the rivalries of its rival sports in the United States, let alone its rival leagues throughout Europe and the rest of the world. It could happen one day, but count me skeptical.